In this section, we move on to some instructional strategies that you can use during sessions and also talk a little bit about planning and actually conducting a facilitated session or recitation. By the end of this segment, you should be able to describe the rationale and instructor responsibilities for concept questions, worked examples, and using multiple modes of representation. You should also be able to develop a plan for a facilitated session or recitation. On this slide, you see an example of one of the instructional strategies that we use, concept questions or poll questions, also called clicker questions. This fluid dynamics question investigates student understanding of Bernoulli's principle and what happens to the speed of flow after going through a constricted area. In our sessions, students are asked to choose a response individually, and then we place them into breakout sessions where they have to discuss the response they chose, along with why they chose it. We have permanently assigned breakout groups so that they become familiar with each other and feel comfortable sharing with one another. Some of the specifics about concept questions. A concept question asks students to process the information that you've been giving them, to use it to reason or solve a problem. It's a great way to provide them with a mental break during an intense learning session. Concept questions really serve two purposes. They allow students to recognize how much they do or do not understand about the lesson, so therefore self-evaluation. Concept questions also allow you as the instructor to recognize how well students understand what you are teaching them, so serve as formative assessment for the instructor. If they're not understanding, you can slow down, you can give them more examples, or you can allow them to work with the information in another way. What are concept questions? They're questions that focus on a single concept. They're not solvable by relying on equations. They have multiple choice answers. They are unambiguously worded and are of medium difficulty. How do we administer these? Typically, the instructor poses a question first. Students have 1 to 2 minutes to think about the question, and then students answer the question individually. In this case, when they respond to the question, it engages all of them, rather than the more typical case where the instructor asks a question orally, 1 or 2 students raise their hand, and then one is chosen to respond, which really only actively engages one of them. The other students in the room may be paying attention and thinking, but they may not be, particularly those who may be lost or don't understand, who don't even think about the question. So by asking a poll question and requiring them to respond, you have engaged them at least in some respect. Students then discuss the question with their group. In our case, it's with their breakout group. Sometimes when instructors use this in lecture sessions, they have them discuss their answer with a peer or the person sitting beside them. But again, in a recitation or in our sessions, we do use breakout groups, and it takes a good 10 to 15 minutes for that activity. This is the part that actually makes the activity interactive and engages all of them again instead of just a few. It allows students to engage also in peer instruction or teaching each other. Sometimes the best description of difficult concepts comes from a peer who has just learned it themselves because they use language that both parties understand, and sometimes they explain it in more detail than an instructor who knows the concept very, very well and is an expert in that area. After discussing the question with the group, students then record their revised answers individually. And then in our sessions, we have a larger discussion about the answers that are chosen and why the answers not chosen are not correct. We ask them to volunteer to explain why they did or did not choose each of the choices. And again, we have opportunities to engage more than one student, because after someone volunteers and explains why they chose an answer, we then ask everybody who agrees with that to raise their hand, or anybody who disagrees to raise their hand. We ask questions like, does anybody want to add to that explanation? Or does anybody have anything different to say? So some facilitating type questions that encourage participation by more than one student. Most online platforms have icons for raising hands or check marks and X's so that you can use the one system that I just mentioned, and you can use these as signals to get responses from all students. And then finally, the instructor reviews or explains the correct answer if needed. In our case, we do prepare slides with the correct answers and some of the explanation, and that serves to reinforce the discussion that the students have just had. I often show an example of a concept question being done in class so that people kind of have a model. I use a YouTube video of Professor Eric Mazur from Harvard. He has researched and written extensively about interactive teaching and authored a book full of concept questions for physics. In fact, I used the blood example that I showed earlier was from that booklet. You can search for Eric Mazur Shows Interactive Teaching on YouTube to see this example. And again, it's nice to kind of have a model to see how this actually goes in the classroom. He uses this in a large lecture, so you'll notice that he only lets the students turn to their neighbor and talk for several minutes, whereas in our sessions and in a recitation section, you may want to extend that to 10 or 15 minutes with a slightly larger group. The second strategy I'd like to talk about is worked examples. This is exactly what it sounds like, giving students a model of a problem solution, either written or oral. You may be wondering how a worked example is different from what you may normally do if you already demonstrate how to solve problems to your students. You may be thinking that good instruction has always included this kind of demonstration. We demonstrate how to solve problems, and then we assign practice problems as homework. The difference with a worked example is that we give students a chance to study and explain the worked example to themselves or to a peer instead of just showing them and then moving on. The problem with simply showing them how to do a problem or showing them how to do things is that students can follow along when you explain in class, but they remain unable to do the practice problems on their own. This is because students now have the increased cognitive load of trying to consider all of the details of the problem, and those things that seem very automatic to you but seem very complicated to them, plus the new techniques that you've shown them. If they're given an opportunity to study worked examples, students can devote their limited working memory capacity to building schema of performing the task. They can think more about why various steps are needed rather than using memory to think about what step is next or what the best approach might be. So let's talk more about this. So what is the purpose of worked examples? It's to actually decrease the cognitive load for students when learning complex problem solving. What is it? It's a demonstration problem. It's a step-by-step solution solving a problem. It can be written or it can be oral. It could be in a textbook, on a slide, or even written on the blackboard. To be effective, however, a worked example must be studied. You might explain the problem first, but then you should give students time to think about it or annotate what they've just saw. Even better, ask them to explain their understanding to the person sitting beside them. So thinking about and talking through a problem is a strategy known as self-explanation. And you see on the slide I have it requires deep thinking to be effective. We know that students who self-explain learn better than those who simply look over material and do not think deeply about it. To self-explain means that you are providing rationale, you're reasoning, you're making connections, and that's a form of a constructive mode of engagement. MIT students told me that this is the way they study for exams, by self-explaining all of the homework problems that they've solved throughout the unit or the chapter. When do we use worked examples? As the concept is introduced in class. For particularly difficult or complex problems, an add-on strategy to worked examples is known as backward fading, or repeating the demonstration and omitting the final steps, thus requiring the student to remember how to do one part of the solution. This can be a gradual process, in 2 or 3 steps if the problem is complex. The transition from worked example to practice by way of backward faded completion examples provides learners with a smooth trajectory from novice to expert. You do need to consider the learner experience, however. This practice is good for novice learners. It helps them build a schema for working the problem, but it's not good for experienced learners. Once their schema is established, it's better to solidify that schema by exercising it or giving them practice problems. Here I have a model of a progression of backwards fading. Suppose you have a 3-step problem that you're working with the students, and in this model, you can see in the diagram the hollow circle is what's worked in the lesson, and the completed circle is what's worked by the learner. Initially, you would ask the learner to view the example where the problem is totally solved. You would ask them to self-explain how the solution was reached. Here you could use prompts also to direct their thinking. Then you could give them a similar problem, only this time the 3rd step is not shown and they must complete it. So that's completion example 1 in the diagram. Then you give them another problem with the 2nd and 3rd steps omitted, and they must complete those. And so that's completion example 2 on the diagram. Finally, they are given yet another problem, a complete practice problem, in which they must complete all of the steps. Restructuring your lesson to include a worked example, followed by practice problems that gradually allow students to apply what they're learning, will reduce some of the cognitive load that students experience, and it has also been shown to produce better learning in less time. The 3rd strategy that we use is multiple representations. This strategy refers to giving students information in different formats. The multiple modes of representation reinforce the information and helps bridge the gap between learners' individual differences. Research also tells us about some combinations of representations that are more effective for learning than others. In particular, a picture or diagram accompanied by a verbal narration is better for learning than a picture with a text description. And here you can see multiple modes of a damping equation represented symbolically, also represented by text or verbal representation, a visual representation, and this also happens to be a simulation that students could interact with, and finally you could use a physical representation, something such as a rubber band that's attached to something and you can show it vibrating. We'll move on now to planning a session using a process called backward design. When planning lessons, it's important to think not only about what we want to teach or do in the session, it's important to think about what we want students to know by the end of the session and how we'll know if they know it. The backward design process emphasizes the importance of thinking about these 3 components of effective teaching. For each of our facilitated sessions, we create a lesson plan that includes the intended learning outcomes for the session, or what's important, in terms of determining acceptable evidence and how we know if they get it. We do formative assessment for the sessions, meaning that we listen to students in the breakout sections or in their breakout groups, hearing what they're saying. We look at the questions posted in chat during the session to determine if they're understanding the material that's presented. In our sessions, and as in the recitation section, you typically don't give exams, and so we use formative assessment, or we're following how the students are thinking and discussing the material as our evidence for knowing that they understand it. And once we have the learning outcomes and we think about how we'll assess those or what kinds of things we'll look for, we then plan the activities or experiences. Again, in these sessions, we use 1 or 2 poll questions, and then we use a worked example. This is the order of events for our facilitated sessions. After giving the learners an introduction to the topics for the day, we review the intended learning outcomes for the session. This is followed by the concept or poll questions, in which we present the question and possible responses, as I mentioned earlier. Everybody responds to the question individually, and then we typically use what I'm referring to here as method 1. We break out into small groups, and within those small groups, each learner tells how they responded to the question and why they chose the response that they did. The group leader for each group helps them come to consensus about a correct response. And we have chosen group leaders for each of the groups, and they have permanently assigned breakout groups, as I mentioned earlier. We ask everybody to respond to the question individually again after they come back to the larger group from their breakout groups. And then we have a discussion where we ask for volunteers to explain their response that they chose. We ask for volunteers to explain their rationale for choosing both correct answers and for not choosing the incorrect answers, because sometimes that's just as informative to hear why an answer is incorrect as opposed, in addition to hearing why answers are correct. As a way to engage all the learners, again, we ask who agrees or disagrees with the explanations that are given, so that we try to keep each of the learners with us as we go through those discussions. Sometimes we add a second poll question depending on time, and for that one we do not use extended time for discussion. We don't break out into groups. We keep the discussion in one larger group. So same procedure initially. We present the question and the possible responses. Everybody responds to the question individually, but then we ask for volunteers to explain the response they chose within the larger group. And again, we ask for explanations for correct and incorrect responses. We use the same techniques, asking who agrees or disagrees with the explanations. And then we ask everyone to respond to the question individually, again, after this discussion. As another way to assess whether students are understanding the material, we can track whether students have answered incorrectly and changed to a correct answer after these discussions. We then follow with the worked example where we discuss difficult concepts from the material. The facilitators intersperse their explanation of the problem's solution with questions for the learners to keep them engaged throughout that. They use prompts for discussion such as, what step do you think would come next? Why do you think I used that particular procedure? What might happen if we changed, this particular parameter or this variable? Things to get them thinking about the problem that's being explained to see if we can, to challenge them to engage. The last few minutes of the session are devoted to student questions, either about something that they've been wondering about all along or something that they still don't understand about the material that was covered during the session. And then we review the intended learning outcomes again, so the learners can think about whether or not they have met those outcomes throughout the session. And lastly, we ask the learners to complete MUD cards. MUD is an acronym for Most Unclear Discussion, and it serves as a mini evaluation or feedback for the session. We ask what points learners are still unclear about or the muddiest point. We also ask how difficult the material was for them and how much of the course materials they had a chance to cover before the session. And this gives us a sense of whether we're developing materials at a level that meets their needs. We use this information to make revisions to the course materials, as well as a basis for locating supplemental materials to send to learners after the session. In summary, in this presentation, we've talked about the facilitated session, the components of it, what the roles and responsibilities of the facilitator are, how we get students engaged, what are things that keep students engaged, how we plan active learning activities using the ICAP framework, 3 instructional strategies that we use in our facilitated sessions that could also be used in recitations, and then the actual process that we use for conducting a session. We hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact either Brandon or I, and we wish you much success in your online teaching.